Good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. On behalf of the FDA and the University of Maryland Center of Excellence in Regulatory Science and Innovation, we welcome you to our ADEPT 9 workshop on enhancing diversity in therapeutics development for pediatric patients. My name is Mulugeta. I'm the Associate Director for Policy and Research in the Division of Pediatrics and Maternal Health. I will be co-moderating this workshop with my colleague, Dr. Carla Epps, also from the Division of Pediatrics and Maternal Health. Before I introduce the first speaker, I'm going to invite Dr. Lin Yao, who's the Division of the Director for the Division of Pediatrics and Maternal Health, to quickly make a special announcement, and then we can get started with the rest of the agenda. So, Dr. Yao.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining in person. Really appreciate seeing all of you here. So I do have a quick announcement. Actually, it made me think, though. I'm sorry. I'm going to take the prerogative of the microphone of the bully pulpit, I guess, and just remind everybody that ADEPT 9, does anybody even remember what ADEPT means? ADEPT means Advancing the Development of Pediatric Therapeutics. And I had a conversation with our dear colleague, Diane Murphy, and this was about 11 years ago, okay? And she said, well, we want to use these pediatric advisory committees for something that is, more than just reviewing the 10,000th safety, whatever, prescription and review all the safety, safety data at these pediatric advisory committees. And we said, well, maybe there's another way to invite the community to come, not necessarily as formal as an advisory committee, and start working on issues that are related to pediatric therapeutics development across academia, industry, and regulatory. And that's how the ADEPT meetings began. And this would have been our 10th year. And the reason it's not is because during the pandemic, we missed 1 year. So next year, stay tuned, we'll have a grand 10th anniversary ADEPT. But I did want to give you that perspective. So this year, of course, another topic that I think is obviously important to everybody in the audience. So just wanted to give those brief historical remarks. Now, the important, and the reason I'm up here is to, if you wouldn't mind looking at what you have on your table, I'm just going to read this. Please be advised that the U.S. General Services Administration is conducting baseline water tests at FDA's White Oak campus and other FDA locations. This is part of a nationwide GSA initiative assessing federal buildings of certain heavy metals and waterborne bacteria. You may see signage posted at designated water fixtures or areas. Please do not use these fixtures until signage is removed. Out of an abundance of caution, the FDA is recommending occupants refrain from consuming tap water at the White Oak campus. Where feasible, bottled water and/or water coolers are being made available for use. So there is bottled water for all of the participants today. I can assure you that all the food that's being prepared, the coffee, has been prepared such that it is safe to use and drink. So I just wanted to give you that announcement in case you hadn't heard. And please feel free to see me if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Lynn. So we're going to go ahead and move forward on the agenda. The first speaker is Dr. Hilary Marston. She's the Chief Medical Officer at the FDA, and she's going to walk in momentarily. Is it? There we go. Okay, good. So want to take a couple of minutes just to recap how we got where we are right now, et cetera, what the FDA has been doing in this space.
So the FDA broadly is committed to making sure that we get safe and effective medical products out to all populations, particularly including children. We know that clinical trials are such an important part of this, and we know that clinical trials historically have inadequately represented diverse populations. We also know that they've inadequately represented children. So when you take those two things together, you obviously have quite a problem that we need to take a concerted effort to address. FDA is committed to doing our part to change this, but we also know that we only play one small part of the ecosystem. But we're doing what we can, and we need the partners in this room to really advance this further. So enrolling diverse populations, just want to take a moment to address what that actually means. So we obviously all think of racial and ethnic diversity, very important aspect of diversity. We also need to think about clinical diversity, right? So what specific comorbidities might people have? What stage of disease might they be in? Also, the conditions that they live in, right? So socioeconomic factors. We need to have all of these aspects addressed in our diversity planning for these sorts of trials. So it's definitely not easy. The reasons to do this are myriad, right? So we want to make sure that the products that we have to treat children, that we understand how they're going to work in all populations. We need to be able to predict that. We also know that it's the moral thing to do, right? So it is the right thing to do to make sure that we are arming clinicians, parents, patients, with tools that we truly understand as we're administering them to that. And the only way that we can do that is to make sure that we're actually studying. So importantly, you got to plan for this, right? I mean, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but this is not something that happens on its own. You have to plan, and you have to plan in advance. So one of the things that the FDA has been calling for is diversity action plans across all trials. We also call for pediatric study plans. In those diversity action plans, we actually just put out a guidance on our thinking here. We want to ensure that trial preparers are thinking in advance, delineating the strategies that they're going to use, and thinking first about which aspects of diversity that they want to incorporate into their trials. So you want to think about the patient population that's going to be using the product. That might be different, obviously, from the patient population as a whole, right? So that's the first step. Then thinking about the different challenges that individuals who might be using the products might encounter in their days and how to incorporate that into your trial. So we try to go through in a systematic way, ways that developers can think about it. In addition, we had put out a guidance in 2020 to think about different aspects of development. So there, what we were talking about was really ways to think about the actual individuals that you were going to enroll in the trial, and ways to think about eligibility criteria. So moving forward, we have a number of other tools that we're using to look at improving diversity. These are tools like innovation in clinical trials. For example, decentralized trials. So we like to think about decentralized elements, the types of things that we can do in order to make sure that trials are more accessible to people. So for example, if you're looking at rural populations, they might not have a clinic near them. These sorts of tools can be helpful. All right. In addition, we want to make sure that we're thinking particularly about community engagement. Community engagement for pediatric trials might well look different. We need to look at ways that we're going to reach not just populations broadly, but how are we going to reach their parents? How are we going to reach their caregivers? The sorts of strategies that you might use in other trials might not be suitable for pediatric. In addition, we want to think about ways that we're going to interact not just with the patient population, with their clinicians, with their communities, with their industry, with regulators. So I think in this room we have the right people to take a look at these issues, to really dive into them, to come up with specific strategies and looking forward to seeing what you guys come up with as we bring these two issues together. So thank you. That's a little bit about where we've been, looking forward to knowing where we're heading. This is the group that will help us find that out. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marston, for that introductory talk. Our next speaker is Mathilda Fienkeng. She's one of the directors in the Office of Medical Policy, and I'm going to invite her to come up to the stage.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. So as you heard, I am going to give you a brief overview of a workshop that was held in November of last year. So first off, let me go, I have nothing to disclose. And as you heard Dr. Marston say, we talk about clinical trial diversity. Why is it important? Well, clinical trials provide the critical evidence that determines whether a product is safe and effective. And ideally, we want to make sure that the enrolled population, to the extent possible, reflects the diversity of the population that is going to use the product. And FDA is committed to this, and we do this through different means, which I'm not going to reiterate here. In December of 2022, Congress passed the Food, Drug, Omnibus Reform Act, FDORA for short. And FDORA had several requirements. One was for FDA to convene a public workshop on diversity in clinical trials, to also publish a report on that. It also requires sponsors to submit diversity action plans, as you heard, and it required FDA to also issue guidance on diversity action plans. So today I'm going to briefly talk about those things. In November of 2023, we did convene a 2-day public workshop to fulfill that requirement. We solicited and received input on increasing diversity in clinical trials specific to underrepresented populations. The workshop attendees were very diverse, as you can see on the screen. We also published a report, a summary report on that, which is available online for you. The topics that we discussed at that workshop were not specific to pediatrics, of course. But while the discussions there were general and sometimes specific to other populations, those topics were relevant. They are relevant for pediatric populations as well. And they will be complementary, as you will see, to what we are going to discuss today. But these are the different topics that were discussed, but I'll go in depth to them. We talked about where we are now as it relates to clinical trial diversity. One key takeaway was the fact that despite all the efforts that have been made, a lot of progress have been made, some populations continue to be underrepresented in clinical trials. And also there were common barriers across these different populations. And those common barriers include distrust in research, not being referred to clinical trials. Some people are not even asked to join clinical trials. Restrictive eligibility criteria, transportation issues, or providing clinical trial materials in language that is not appropriate for that person or not at their reading level. And finally, lack of community engagement. I know I was sitting today with some advocates, but that community engagement was a key factor that was really talked about, and later on you'll hear more. Now, efforts to address these barriers can help us to achieve that diversity in clinical trials. During that workshop, the participants and the speakers covered strategies to overcome barriers in clinical trials. And one key takeaway was that sponsors need to diversify the trial investigators, the trial sites, and the trial staff. And this will help with better engagement and also ensure the successful recruitment of that diverse population. It was also key to provide language-appropriate cultural literacy training for your trial staff, Also being mindful of the lack of information, of lack of interest or lack of trust in the clinical trial enterprise, especially in those populations that historically have been underrepresented. Usually we talk about building trust and having people trust the clinical trial sponsors, those conducting clinical trials. But it's also key that those who conduct those trials demonstrate trustworthiness. That way, in turn, those you want to recruit can trust you, and they can enroll in clinical trials. Understanding the population, the target population, understanding what that population looks like, what politically, socially, economically, culturally. And of course, engaging a diverse population must begin very early on when you're still drafting your protocol. You want to get those patient population involved at that stage. That way you're setting yourself up for success. And one thing that was reiterated over and over was to simplify the informed consent forms. We talked about other strategies to overcome barriers, talking about employing targeted patient engagement plans, appropriately using decentralized clinical trial features and digital technologies, diversifying your clinical trial site, optimizing your protocol, and also using patient concierges, if necessary, to help with scheduling and reimbursement for travel and transportation. Now, when it came to establishing enrollment goals, which we would hear as part of the requirement for the diversity action plans, the goals should be established based on the stages of your clinical trial participation. So because each stage has its own unique challenges, you want to match your enrollment goals to those. So you're thinking about the initial approach stage, the recruitment stage, and the retention stage. Now, for devices, sponsors are encouraged to really think about the characteristics of various populations with the diseases, and so that when you, early on in your device design, you can incorporate those characteristics and those factors. So engage with the engineers, the physicians, and the patients early in the planning phase. An example is that historically women were excluded from some medical device trials because the size of the devices limited enrollment of participants with smaller body sizes. And lastly, appropriately leveraging different data sources when you think about the prevalence of the disease that you want to use for your enrollment targets. Use different sources to come up with those disease prevalence data. Now, many different approaches on including underrepresented populations were also discussed, specific to subpopulations and in general. One of the important aspects that was reiterated in that workshop was that we need to collect and track relevant demographic data in real time. So you want to use a data-driven assessment as your trial goes along to think about that. There are myths, there are misconceptions, and there are fears, and those need to be addressed. One of the examples was the misconception that somebody, for example, with mental illness might not be able to follow or be adhered to your study protocol or your study requirements, or just excluding, for example, pregnant persons or persons with disabilities or those with complex health conditions. So it's really about a paradigm shift, really shifting from this mindset of let's protect this vulnerable population from clinical trials to a mindset of more let's protect this complex populations with clinical trials. So there is that need for that change in the ecosystem. And of course, providing education to those who are part of that ecosystem to take care of stereotypes. Now, we've heard a lot about decentralized studies and digital health tools. When appropriately used, these tools can enhance the inclusion of a representative population in your trials. So if you think about decentralized features, those may be useful when we talk about patients who are in remote areas. You can leverage decentralized trials to maintain trials during on certain times. For example, during a pandemic, you can use decentralized trial features during severe weather or during a war. We can also incorporate those decentralized clinical trial elements in trials that are conducted at the point of care, and that can help and enhance getting a diverse patient population. It's important to evaluate the appropriateness of decentralized clinical trials and digital health technologies. For example, is there availability of broadband? What is the digital literacy of the participants you're trying to enroll in your trials? In all of this, building that human connection is critical, regardless of what tools and what methods you use. So after studies are done, it is important to communicate those data. We do not want a drive-by situation where you come in the community, do the trials, take your results, and move on. But sharing that information with the community, the patients, will help highlight the importance and why it is important to have a diverse representation. When you share that information, protecting the privacy of participants is also very important. Transparency is important, using plain language, visual aids to make that information more accessible and easily understandable. And putting procedures in place to make sure that the information you share is actually accurate information. We have talked a lot about community engagement. It's important to really work collaboratively with the community and face-based organizations. That way we are speaking to communities through a voice of trust. Explain to participants why their participation in trials is important, and build that capacity in your overall diversity strategy. And I cannot stress enough, and in that workshop, bidirectional communication relationship with those communities are key as well. So really, to achieve that meaningful representation in clinical trials takes a village. It is important not only for the agencies, but for the sponsors, the clinicians, the patients. It takes a lot of engagement and sharing of ideas, experiences, and best practices. So we're going to shift gear briefly for the remainder of my time and talk a little bit about the diversity action plans. This guidance, draft guidance, was issued in June of 2024, and it met one of the requirements for FDORA. It actually replaced the April 2022 diversity plans guidance that FDA issued. The guidance is actually still out for public comment, so I encourage you to read that guidance and provide any comments you may have. I have the docket number included on this slide. So why? Why do we need diversity action plans? The short answer is to help improve generalizability of the results of clinical trials in an intended population. So the guidance actually assists sponsors in meeting the requirements for submitting the DAP. So it describes the format and the content of the diversity action plan. It describes the criteria and processes for sponsors who might want to request waivers. And also it provides general recommendations for sponsors to publicly post key information regarding their diversity action plans. Now, which studies will require diversity action plans? For drugs, a clinical investigation that is a phase 3 study, or as appropriate, any other pivotal study of a drug would require a diversity action plan. For devices, any device, a DAP must be included for any investigational device exemption. And for those that do not require an IDE, the DAP must be included for a pre-market notification, request for classification, and application for pre-market approval. FDA strongly recommended that you think about diversity action plan in the entire clinical development program, not just towards the end, but really, we think submit them now, but we want you to think about them early on in the process. What should be included in a DAP? Your DAP should include the goals for your enrollment, and those should be disaggregated by age, by race, by ethnicity, by sex. So if you think about this for any clinically relevant study population, you should also include a rationale for your goals and explain how you intend to meet those goals. The guidance also includes describes the form and the content, as I told you, and it also gives you recommendations to help ensure that the requirements are met. So I have here a list of some selected FDA guidances that speak to diversity in clinical trials, and thus for your reference. I need to acknowledge my colleagues in our division and the different offices. And I am looking forward to a day of learning and sharing with you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mathilda. We're going to take clarifying questions during the panel discussions. Also of note, we're keeping the introductions very brief. You have QR codes at each table, and you can access the bios as well as the meeting agenda. For our online participants, the bios are available also on the event website. Something that we've tried to do a bit differently with this workshop is really incorporate the voice of the patients and families throughout the agenda. And we're really happy to have Michael and Michelle Burgess provide the keynote talk today. They are representatives of the International Children's Advisory Network, or ICANN. So Michael and Michelle, please.
Good morning. My name is Michelle Burgess, and I am here with my son,
Michael Burgess.
We want to thank you all for having us on today. Like it was currently said, we are representatives of the International Children's Advisory Network, affectionately known as ICANN, and we are so honored and privileged to be with you on today. My ICANN family, I see a couple of you. Can you raise your hands out there? Hi there. I see you. Let's give them applause. So everybody, let me just say this. I'm grateful to be here. I am so thankful for the participants and even the individuals that brought this all together. It takes a lot of work to bring a conference like this together. So I want to thank Dr. Carla Epps. She's been so important in this work and helping to guide us. Thank you to Michelle Pollack, Ms. Jennings. Thank you to Robin Ruger. I haven't even seen your faces yet. I'm from Chicago, so I don't know a lot of people per face, but I want to thank you. Thank you to those who have made this possible for us on today. So now that I have gotten all of the formalities out the way, let me just say this. This is my son's first public speaking engagement. So can you all make him feel right at home? He's not in the hospital today. He is not behind a hospital door in a bed. He's standing with his mom. So thank you, Michael. This is my dream to be with you like this. So we have a presentation for you today. It's called Enduring Hope. Please go with us as we take you on a journey of Michael's life and how we have come through some very strong and challenging barriers to clinical trial engagement, but how as a family we have been successful. So I'm going to start us off. It's going to be conversational in tone, and we're just going to go back and forth. So Michael Julian Burgess, my son was diagnosed with sickle cell SS at the age of 1 week old. Michael had his first pain crisis at age 8 months. And I remember the doctors telling us that this is a time bomb, it's ticking. So you won't know exactly how the disease is going to behave until you kind of live it out. So my husband and I were on pins and needles when he was first born, and the first crisis hit at just a tender, tiny age of 8 months. During that time, this is in 2008, the hospitalization frequency was about maybe 3 times per year, so it was hard, but it was manageable. And Michael started treatments at Lurie's Children's Hospital at the age of 8.
So throughout my life, I've had multiple surgeries, starting at the age of 3, and most recently, about a year and a half ago, I just got my gallbladder taken out. And ever since 2018, the hospitalizations have just been going up, just drastically. It was told that it's probably because of me being a teenager and puberty, but we don't know the exact reason yet. And I began this new clinical trial back in April this year, and it's really been helping, and it's really made my life a lot easier.
Thank you, Michael. Now, let me just take the formal hat off. This is a picture of my family, you all, so it was a lot to even get us together to take this picture. You know, families are under a lot of stress these days, so just taking a picture is phenomenal, okay? Michael thoroughly enjoys spending time with his loved ones and friends to help ease the stress of constant chronic pain. So Michael has a tribe, and this is his tribe. This is his community. We undergird him when hospitalizations come, even when clinical trial participation is a factor, we still undergird our son.
So back in, was it 2020? Back in 2020, when I was 12, I was recommended for this clinical trial, which I'm on right now, which is really helping. And I was next in line to get it, and then suddenly the FDA changed the age to 16, and so I was no longer qualified for the clinical trial. And no matter what my parents said, no matter what I said, there was nothing that changed the fact that I had to wait another 4 years and enduring pain for another 4 years while the hospitalizations kept going up with age. And I started to lose hope that it was never going to get better, and I don't know how I was going to endure these 4 years. But with my family behind my back supporting me and my friends, I was able to keep going and finally made it.
Thank you, Michael. And so Michael has been a participant in several clinical trials during his lifetime. And so these are some of the barriers, the real-time barriers that I've heard some presenters already talk about. Family community distrust. So we come from a larger tribe of family and community. We are deeply embedded in the heart of our community in one of Chicagoland's most underserved neighborhoods. And so my husband and I are leaders there. And when we would, discuss that we're going to have clinical trials, we're going to enroll Michael in this trial, as Doctor talked to us about it, this could possibly be something that could bring some relief. We don't know. There was a lot of distrust that was already told to us, that was communicated to us. Well, why would you let your son do this? Are you sure? Do you remember? Do you remember what happened? Talking about, historically what has happened in our Black and underserved communities to our African Americans. So that was hard to get through. It was hard to go to the hospital, finish that particular treatment for that trial, and to come home and to, so you decided to do it, huh? You went against, our better judgment, huh? And so the distrust, it was hard to overcome that barrier. The validity of suffering is something else that was hard to overcome. Oftentimes, because Michael has what I call an invisible disability, there are those who would say, well, is he really, really suffering? Do you really need to go through this clinical trial? Or oh my God, like, sometimes even hearing jokes just about the suffering and does it really take all of that? That is a barrier. That's a mental barrier. How many of you all know that comes and attacks your mental health when you hear those things? Distance, underserved communities. We live in Austin, which is a underserved Chicagoland community. It's amazingly the largest community in Chicago, with over 475,000 people that live in that particular area. It's well populated, but it's underserved. That was a barrier to clinical trial. Financial constraints, job flexibility. Some of the trials that Michael has been involved in have required so much time off. And I have to pay a mortgage just like you. So that was really hard because sometimes our jobs were even threatened. My husband is a high school principal at one of the top high schools in Chicagoland. I am also a district administrator, and our jobs were often threatened with the amount of time that we would have to give towards Michael participating in the clinical trial. Financial participations and stressors, family participation and stressors. I have 2 other children, as you all saw in the previous slides. They have lost their parents. They lost their parents. And oftentimes that's something we talk about as a family. So when my kids hear, one more thing, Ma, one more thing to manage, it's what we have to do. So that's a stressor. So that's a barrier to clinical trial participation. And just endurance, mental capacity, just the stress of it all, and disappointment when we're not approved for a clinical trial. So these are all barriers that our family has had to face and had to overcome.
So recently, when I was talking about in April, I was able to qualify for the trial again because I was turning 16, and hope kind of reunited for me because I was told that this clinical trial would really help for sickle cell patients, and I was very excited to see what life actually feels like to be less in pain. I'm still in pain, but it's a lot less than before, and it's a lot less frequent than before. And it's just been really nice to just have a little bit of stress taken off my life with this clinical trial. And I still wish that this could have happened 4 years ago, but I know that life happens, and you just got to keep rolling with it, and that's what I'm doing right now. And I was able to be a part of my hospital's advisory board for kids. It's been, I think, 3 years now, and it's been nice to be able to advocate for other kids and just to be a big help in changing my hospital for the better. And then I was able to go to the international version at the ICANN conference for the past 2 years, and that has been a really nice journey to be on, to be able to travel and meet tons of new people that are going through similar challenges that I am, and just to know that I'm not alone and that there's other people like me, and it's been very nice.
Well, I want to talk about it. Michael just got his driver's permit. So can you all That's huge. I mean, it might sound like a little thing, but when you're a kid and you're struggling with a chronic disease that you're told you're going to die with, I mean, it's the little things really help build that endurance of hope. And clinical trials is another thing that can help build our endurance for hope. So recommendations, everybody. We come to the conclusion of our presentation. So to foster patient and family engagement, you all have said it already, so I'll just reiterate it. Access to medical resources in their communities. So we live in Austin, Chicago, Illinois. There are very few medical clinics where we are. So Lurie's Children's Hospital is about 7 miles from our home. It is a trek. Michael's hospitalizations had spiked up to about 3 times per month, about 4 days each time. So the back and forth, it's just hard. So adding a clinical trial participation to that. So that's what we need as real-time community dwellers. We need listening tours to ensure that our needs are met. I know that this particular public workshop is part of a listening tour, having our voices at the table, saying, you know, equity of voice. Ms. Burgess, Michael, come to the table. We want to hear from you. We want to hear what you're experiencing and what do you really need. That can help foster, I believe, success in any clinical trial and research. Community town halls to educate communities on the impact and importance of disease awareness. See, in our neighborhood, the distrust is very, very high. People would rather stay behind doors and suffer with their disease or illness, self-medicate, self-treat, than actually to go and see a physician until the situation is almost too late. So we would really benefit from community town halls where hospitals and clinicians could send representatives to come out and gather us as a community and say, welcome to the table. Your voice and your opinion matters. Finally, political will to eradicate systematic injustices in healthcare. We need you. Like the presenter before me said, this is bringing the human connection. We need you. We need your expertise coupled with our lived experience to really bring forth clinical trials that are really going to be impactful and effective. Thank you all so much for this opportunity. I would like to thank Ms. Leanne West from ICANN, who's the president. I would like to thank her team, and I'd like to thank all of you. I look forward to meeting you all. You are no longer strangers. You are friends. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Burgess and Michael. It's really hard to believe this is his first time speaking in public, so maybe if we can give him one more round of applause. Okay, our next speaker is Christine Lee. She's the Acting Associate Commissioner and Director for the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Burgess. Michael, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. I think it's so important to recognize not only your voices, but your lived experiences, as you mentioned. You said a couple of key words in your talk that I hope that I can also highlight: equity of voices, town halls, the bidirectional relationship, that connection piece, the humanization element, which I really hope that, in this talk, we also amplify. And I also want to point out that I'm going to try to avoid word clouds with this talk and really focus on actions, which I think that everyone is looking more forward into. All right, so I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes or so going over the FDA Office of Minority Health and Health Equity and the work that we have done to really advance pediatric health equity. Here's our standard disclaimer slide. So the FDA Office of Minority Health and Health Equity, also known as OMHHE, our mission is to promote and protect the health of diverse populations through both research and communication that addresses health disparities. We also have a vision, this is my favorite vision, which is to create a world where health equity is a reality for all. So what do we do in this space? I'm not going to go too much into the operationalization of the office, but we have two programmatic areas. We have the research and collaboration program, and we have an outreach and communication program. The intent for all of our programs is to really connect with the communities that we serve and really advance health equity, including understanding the unmet needs of our diverse communities. So as mentioned, I'm going to avoid word clouds as much as I can here. We all know the right words to use: equity, population health, health disparities. These are words that we all know to use. I want to try to avoid this and show you the actions that we have taken in the last 3 to 4 years. In September 2021, we launched our Enhanced Equity Initiative, which really started this action piece when it comes to health equity. In March of 2023, which is about a year and a half ago or so, we launched our Enhanced Equity Research Hub, which I talk about very briefly here, but after talking to some of our audience members, I really think I should have had a couple extra slides here, but please, if I don't have slides here, come up to me afterwards and I'll walk you through the Enhanced Equity Research Hub. And a year and 3 months ago, we launched our newest initiative, which one of our PIs is here. You'll hear from her in just a little bit, Dr. Billy Jo Kipp, the OMHHE Racial and Ethnic Minority Acceleration Consortium for Health Equity. The key term here is acceleration, because many times we tend to talk about this, but where's the action and the acceleration to action? So this is, even though this is only a year and 3 months old, I think we've done tremendous work thanks to our wonderful PIs that we have. So going into the first action item here, which is the Enhanced Equity Initiative, the Enhanced Equity Initiative has 3 equity branches or 3 equity pillars. The first one is equity in clinical trials, which is the topic of today, and I'll go into some of our projects in this space. The Enhanced Equity Clinical Trial area looks at not only understanding barriers and unmet needs, which was shared a little bit earlier today around the clinical trial barriers, but also looking at strategies, especially community-driven strategies, on what it means to increase engagement for your community. We also have our equity and data efforts. As we know, there's a lot of missingness when it comes to equity of data. Many times without data, we don't know what direction we're heading in. Are we heading in north, south, west, east, right? So really understanding our comprehensive data when it comes to our diverse populations that we serve. The third element here, which, I think it was meant to be, Mrs. Burgess talked about equity of voices. This is also one of our equity branches. The equity of voices is a 2-part branch. The first part is really understanding the unmet needs. Mrs. Burgess talked about town halls, going into communities. This is exactly what Equity of Voices has done. Through our community leaders like Dr. Billy Jo Kipp here, for example, in the tribal nations that she'll talk about in just a couple minutes or so, it's really having the community leaders have these town halls. I always say that many times if you don't have that trusted connection, why would someone share with you their unmet needs? There's no trust, right? So many times when we do town halls that don't have that trusted element, what ends up happening is that we get another word cloud because there's the lack of trust. So really having, for example, our tribal colleges, our HBCUs, our fairly qualified healthcare system docs, do the town halls, really connect with the community, what we find is there's a richness of information that comes out, information that we may not have ever heard of before. The unmet needs really surface to the top. The other thing with Equity of Voices is after we understand the barriers, the unmet needs, then we can better tailor communication strategies. For example, my sister, she's 10 years younger than me, we communicate very differently. I have no idea of what language she's using half the time. So really understanding, how the communication preferences need to be tailored. Okay, so Moving on, we haven't updated this for our FY24, but we will be soon. As you can see, the growth of the OMHHE Enhanced Equity Initiative has grown tremendously from about 10 projects in 21 to now we'll be topping at more than 60 projects, all which can be found on our Enhanced Equity Research Hub. So here, I would really I'm a very visual person, so I like to see the growth of our program. So what does it mean? Remember, I promised a lack of word cloud, so here's my stand-in. So our Enhanced Equity Initiative of FY21, our equity of clinical trials. Well, what are the fruits of our labor here? So, of course, I'm a Floridian girl, so I had to use oranges to set the example here. But as you can see here, this is the product, the fruits of our labor over the last 3 to 4 years. We are now at 24, not 22, clinical trial studies that look at the barriers for our populations, looking at it from an age perspective, from a racial and ethnic minority perspective, from a rural perspective, from a tribal population perspective. It doesn't make any sense to clump diverse populations into one bucket. For example, I talked about my sister a little bit earlier. Although we're both Asian, her communication strategies are very different from mine. Her unmet needs are very different from mine. So it's very important as we're creating these tailored clinical trial strategies that we keep this in mind. The other thing that Mrs. Burgess mentioned a little bit earlier was the connection point. So having an ability, a platform to connect with the FDA. I'll show a couple pictures near the end of platforms, environments that we have created at the FDA, as well as going into the community. So we're trying to do one here, one within a community, one here again, and one within the community to really get the voices. When it comes to meetings, workshops, listening to diverse perspectives. Also, we have our OMHHE guidance document. Mathilda mentioned a little bit earlier the diversity plan guidance. We also have our race and ethnicity standardization guidance document, and we also have our long-standing clinical trial campaign. So here's our long-standing clinical trial campaign. Everything is publicly available. If you want free material shipped to you, we can also do that also. But online, we have about 12 languages available. We have our fact sheets, we have our webpage, we have podcasts, we have webinars that really highlight the importance and strategies on advancing clinical trial diversity. Here's the guidance that I mentioned in one of the oranges. So this is our guidance on the collection of race and ethnicity data in clinical trials. The purpose of this guidance, I mentioned a little bit earlier, the importance of data, the equity of data element. Without standardization of race and ethnicity data reporting, it's very difficult to understand what that data means. So this is our guidance on the collection of race and ethnicity data in clinical trials. The main point here is using standardized terminology for race and ethnicity helps ensure the data is collected consistently and supports demographic data analysis. All right, so this was this past April for our National Minority Health Month. You'll recognize in the middle in pink, Dr. Billy Joe Kipp, who is here, who'll be speaking a little bit later. But this was really an invitation from our communities, from our tribal nations, our racial and ethnic minority populations, our rural populations to come here and share the strategies that work for their communities. And what was very interesting was that there was very overlapping similarities in what they were saying, but very important. It was important to recognize the nuances too. So that was also highlighted throughout. I mentioned a little bit earlier about the 60-plus projects that we have funded through the Enhanced Equity Initiative. This is just one that was tailored towards our young adults. So here, this was a very interesting process. What we heard through the focus groups with young adults were, yes, we want to participate in clinical trials, but I don't want you to tell me what to do. All right? Second of all, but if you don't tell me, I'm going to be mad at you. All right, so this is where I was like, oh my goodness, I don't know what to do. So they took a bunch of these young adults and threw them in a room and they're like, workshop it, right? So this was their creation, which I call a dating app. So this is the clinical trial dating app. So here, what the young adults wanted, they wanted control over their preferences. So they would put in the app, I'm looking for this in a clinical trial. I'm looking for this geographic area. I'm looking for, these are the things that are important to me. And then the app would geolocate those preferences to a clinical trial that match their preferences. So this is just one of the innovations that come through our Enhanced Equity Innovation Awards. Dr. Ann McMahon will be talking about this in just a couple more minutes, but this is another way for us to really advance research, which is through our intramural grant funding process, which is funding our internal FDA scientists. And here, I won't talk too much about this because she'll do a much better job than me, but her study really aims to highlight and test the hypothesis that children from racial and or ethnic minority populations are underrepresented in pediatric clinical trials. Moving on to the second equity branch, or equity of voices. So what have we done in this space? So we have 17 equity of voices research projects. Remember, it's two parts. One part is really understanding the unmet needs, and the second part is the culturally tailored communication strategies. We also have our equity of voices videos that are publicly available online and anyone can access. We also have our podcasts and webinars, and we also have our language access program that focuses on translation. So here's some of the work that's in this space, our podcast, which is available online. If you're ever in a long car ride, please tune in. And here's our language access program. Going on to equity of data, we have 6 projects within this space. And I just wanted to highlight that all of these studies actually contributed to the last orange right there, which is the Enhanced Equity Research Hub, which I mentioned just a little bit while ago. I'll get to that in just a little bit. So for equity of data, when we talk about equity of data, there's so many challenges in this space, from the lack of attention of awareness of the racial and ethnic minority data in real-world data settings, the lack of understanding of potential covariates and demographic variables that can contribute to confounding outcomes, and a lack of attention to barriers that prevent reporting from racial and ethnic and other underserved populations. Missingness is a huge problem also. Sometimes the data sets that we look at have missingness from about 60 to 70% missingness when it comes to racial and ethnic minority information, which at that point I'm not really sure what we can do with this data. And then also there is that struggle with understanding prevalence estimates of disease population because of all of the challenges listed above. If you have such a high missingness, how can you calculate the prevalence of the disease? Oh, okay. All right. So this is an area that, one of the studies that we did was we funded a study with Stanford University with Dr. David Reckhoff of Stanford, and he really looked at understanding the American Family Cohort Database, which is the largest EHR data set on primary care in the U.S., and this was really our first way of understanding what other types of data are out there that we can look at that doesn't have such a high percentage of missingness. And so this was an area that we have been exploring. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go through these slides really quickly. But as you can see, here's some of the pediatric data that we have from the study. The Enhanced Equity Research Hub, as mentioned a little bit earlier, and I really wish I had an extra slide or two here to show you the Enhanced Equity Research Hub, but you can search by, this is all publicly available, just Google Enhanced Equity Research Hub. You can search by race. So for example, if you wanted to look at the work that's been done in the space of the Asian population when it comes to clinical trial strategies, you would pull down here and you would choose Asian. The Enhanced Equity Research aim, let's say you're looking at voices. You wanted to understand what has been done to elevate and amplify the voices of our diverse communities. You would then scroll down here and you'll do a drop down, and you would click Equity of Voices or Equity of Clinical Trials. You'll be able to sort by age, so under 18, between 18 to 64 and above 64, ethnicity, and then disease condition of interest. We have not too many in here, but we have sorted by, like, for example, sickle cell, hepatitis B, etc. This is a way for you to also sort by disease state. And as mentioned, our newest initiative, the REACH Consortium that was launched 1 year and 3 months ago. So as we were growing the orange tree, does anyone want to point out what was missing in the orange tree? Michael, you want to try? No, okay, all right. So with the orange tree, the problem with the orange tree is that it takes about 5 years to grow an orange. And that, to me, is just too long of a time for us to recognize that there's a health equity problem and for us to take action. So the Racial and Ethnic Minority Consortium, REACH, remember I said acceleration, the A was important here, was a way for us to be responsive to health equity needs. So here, but we know, and Mrs. Burgess brought this up, you can't be responsive if you don't have trust, if you don't have respect, if you don't have bi-directional relationships, you will not have readiness. That's just not how it works. I cannot ask a population to respond if there is no pre-existing relationship there. So once again, it was developed for it to have a timely and efficient way for the FDA to connect with the diverse communities that we serve. Here's some of the REACH Consortium members. So they represent, for example, the federally qualified healthcare systems. In fact, we were just there the last month doing another town hall roundtable. We have the University of Puerto Rico and the healthcare systems within Puerto Rico. We have the University of Hawaii and the Queens Medical Center within Hawaii. We have the tribal communities that will be presented by Dr. Billy Joe Kipp later on. We have community centers, nonprofits serving the Asian community, the LGBTQ plus community, rural communities throughout the nation. And we have our HBCU and faith-based organizations. Here's some of our researchers. As you can see, they have a diverse background from physicians to HBCU presidents to tribal college leaders, from pharmacists to researchers, et cetera. Some of the work, I know I'm totally over time, so I won't go through all of this work, but there's much of the work that's being done in this space is actually looking at advancing clinical trial enrollment for diverse populations. As mentioned, the next couple of slides will just be a couple of pictures, but here's the FDA REACH panel that happened last April, which brought together our communities. Here's an example of the roundtables at the agency. This was focused on rural communities. We also provide environments for our communities to connect because, as Mrs. Burgess says, the humanization is so important. So for the agency to have an ability to connect with the community leaders, with the HBCU presidents, with the tribal leaders, for that connection to happen and to foster and to create an environment for it. And that's it. Any questions, which I'll take later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. Our next speaker is Sue Rahman. She's the Chief Scientific Officer at the Health Data Synthesis Institute. Sue?
Thank you. So, as a pediatric researcher, I was invited to provide some insights from academia. But as a pediatric clinician, the voice of the patient is incredibly important to me. So the voice of children will feature throughout this presentation. Now, this audience is well aware of the importance of pediatric clinical trials, but you may be less aware of their value outside of medical progress. Years ago, we spoke with children engaged in clinical research at our organization and asked them about their experiences. And we learned from them that clinical trials are a way for them to express their altruism. Clinical trials allow them to engage with the healthcare system in a manner that may be very different to what they experience when they're sick. And in their own words, clinical trials offer novel opportunities. And it's my opinion, I'm guessing the opinion of almost everybody here, that those opportunities should be available to all children, irrespective of their circumstances. More recently, we partnered with ICANN to understand children's perspectives on diversity in clinical trials. And the very first question I asked them was, is it important that research includes a diverse group of children? And their affirmation was unanimous. They spoke with us at length about issues related to equity and justice and inclusivity. But it was Ed who brought me to tears when he spoke about their importance to his psychological well-being.
And now I know that I'm not the one who is unique from others. I know there are some people like me. For this is very fundamental. Now I don't feel alone.
I don't feel alone. Have you heard a more powerful argument for inclusivity efforts in clinical trials? We also asked the kids what they thought of when they heard the term diversity in the context of clinical trials. And not surprisingly, they identified age and race and gender and ethnicity at the top of their list. But they also recognized a host of other individual patient factors that in their mind could contribute to the disposition and action of drugs. So back to the topic of my presentation, which is the academic perspective. Why is it relevant? This table here offers a snapshot in time at one point last year from clinicaltrials.gov. There were 440 industry-funded studies posted to clinical trials that met the criteria listed there. And those 440 studies were enrolling children from 8,770 trial sites. And when duplicates were removed, 79% of those trial sites represented academic organizations. So what this tells me is that the inclusivity behaviors adopted by academic researchers shape the representation patterns we see in nearly all pediatric studies. Apart from an investigator's own personal views on diversity and ensuring representation, can we identify other drivers that influence diversity in academic-led pediatric trials? Well, legislation is one place to look. We have the NIH Revitalization Act of 1993, which assures that race and ethnicity is recorded for every trial that receives federal funding. However, there's no enforcement mechanism in that legislation. Just because an investigator has to record and report racial and ethnic data doesn't mean they're ensuring representation in the trials they oversee. Industry behaviors also influence diversity in academic-led pediatric trials. I've worked with industry sponsors for 25 years on trials and cannot recall a single point in time when I was asked about my experience engaging underserved populations. When information was requested on demographics by way of feasibility questionnaires, it was often for the organization as a whole rather than for the clinical trials we conduct. So if representation metrics are lacking in industry trials, we may not be asking the right questions of clinical trial sites up front. Industry also influences diversity in academic-led pediatric trials through their enrollment strategies. When a sponsor opts to engage a larger number of sites with fewer participants per site, you put investigators in a competitive enrollment situation. And that means they don't have the luxury of time or resources to engage less accessible populations. And fewer resources mean less sustained investment in infrastructure for clinical trial sites, especially those trial sites that serve underrepresented populations. So how are we doing in academia? We chose to look at studies funded under the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act as just one indicator of representation in academic studies. Across 34 studies, enrolling at 167 study sites, over 11,000 participants, we saw a reasonably strong agreement between observed enrollment and expected enrollment based on census sampling at the same frequency in the same regions as in the clinical trials. So big picture, it doesn't look bad. But if we restrict our view to this big picture, we are missing a piece of this puzzle. When you start to break it down by geographic region, you can identify clear statistical trends of over and underrepresentation in clinical trials. And when you break it down further by state, In this example, I'm using an ecological marker of diversity as the metric. You can see a large degree of variability across the country. I suspect that degree of variability would be the same or magnified if we were able to look site by site, but those data aren't yet publicly available, and I'm going to argue at the end of this presentation that they very much should be. So let's go back to our kids. Why do they think some studies don't include a diverse group of children? And they had a lot of ideas, and I'm going to give you a second to look at those here. And we are going to dive into some of these in the next few slides. One of the areas where we fall short in academic research is engaging participants with limited English proficiency. These data are from a survey we conducted of major research organizations across the U.S. Now, what we were hoping to identify was the rate of consent form translation in these organizations. What we did identify was that 70% of the responding organizations were not able to pull this information from their IRB systems, their own institutional IRB systems. And if you can't review the data, you can't track progress or the lack thereof. When consent translation was occurring, it was typically into one other language, and that was often Spanish. Now, this issue was so important for us at my former organization that our IRB undertook a 3-year pilot study. What the IRB did was offset the cost of all consent translation for any federal or internally funded study. And what we saw was an exponential increase year over year in the number of trials that had translated consent forms. So progress, good, but we also recognize that consent translation is a very small piece of the puzzle of effective engagement strategies for non-native language speaking participants. We also drop the ball when it comes to participants with limited literacy, who may not fully understand the implications of participation. And this can affect their interest in enrolling in the study. This can affect their ability to effectively deliver on the requirements of a participant as laid out in the protocol. And this particular challenge requires solutions that are a bit more creative. With funding from the National Endowment for the Arts, we chose to look at illustrated consent forms as one possible solution for this challenge. We partnered with local artists and art students to create illustrations. We partnered with the community to vet those illustrations, and we worked very closely with the IRB to ensure that those illustrated consent forms met the requirements laid out by relevant regulations. By the time I left that organization, we had illustrated consent forms in 9 subspecialty programs at the organization. We do a major disservice to our participants and, frankly, ourselves with the misconceptions we have about clinical trial participation, the most misguided and damaging of which is that individuals of the racial and ethnic minorities are not interested in participating in research. These are great data from Wendler who demonstrate absolutely no evidence of decreased participation in interventional studies, in non-interventional studies, and in surgical studies. But if you look at their data closely, what you will see is the minority populations are offered participation in clinical trials at a much lower rate than the majority. I can corroborate the data from Wendler. I spent 25 years working with underrepresented populations, and whether we were doing cross-sectional studies, longitudinal studies, whole genome studies, our participation rates were exceedingly high, and that comes with effective engagement with the community. We hamstring ourselves by designing clinical trials that are excessively burdensome to participants and their families. And this disproportionately impacts patients and participants of low socioeconomic status who may not have the bandwidth to accommodate disruptions to work or family obligations. We went back and revisited those BPCA studies I mentioned earlier to try to understand how do burdensome elements get introduced into trials. We looked at the elements that were introduced by sponsors. We looked at the elements that were recommended by regulators, and not surprisingly, both parties contribute to adding burdensome elements to protocols. if we want to maintain a broad population of patients, I recommend we start thinking about burden-benefit considerations in the same way we've been taught to think about risk-benefit considerations. That means making sure we understand how children perceive burden as well. And we recently undertook a pilot in conjunction with ICANN to get at some of that information. These data from KITE underscore the importance of being thoughtful about what we ask patients and participants to do in clinical trials, especially when we think of the fact that many of the things we may ask them to do never translate into generalizable knowledge. There are systems issues that hamper our ability to ensure representation in clinical trials. Organizational databases may not collect race and ethnicity data adequately, and they may actually collect it incorrectly. This is a striking example of race and ethnicity data as reported by parents on a child's birth certificate versus what winds up in the electronic medical record. And look at the discordance for some of these populations. It really is quite striking. But it's not just a system issue. If patients are reluctant to disclose this information, it may be because we're not asking the question in the right way, or we may not be explaining why this information is important to what we're doing. Finally, there has to be an element of accountability, and academia has been doing a better job of making sure that metrics on race and ethnicity participation is made available. This is not the forum to debate the benchmarking metrics that are being used. Needless to say, there are a number of them in that text box. They have their advantages and limitations. But one, these are very big picture metrics, so they don't allow us to drill down. And two, the most striking thing is that these are all retrospective. So if we want to impact representation in pediatric trials prospectively, we need different types of data. We need to understand who is being provided care in academic organizations and how that compares to who's being offered clinical trial participation in those same organizations. We proposed a metric that takes this into consideration in a 2021 call to action paper that I had published, and we encouraged, actually challenged research organizations to make this data or similar data, it doesn't have to be this metric, publicly available in the same way that we make outcomes data for interventional procedures like transplant and medical management like cystic fibrosis available site by site publicly for everyone to see. A lovely example of where benchmarking can move the needle outside of the healthcare space is in the publishing space. And these are some great data from the Cooperative Children's Book Center at the University of Wisconsin. They look at thousands of children's books every year, and they look at representation in those books and make that information available in creative communications like these. And over the past 40 years, they've been integral in moving the needle on representation in children's books. And there is no reason we can't do the same thing in pediatric clinical trials. I'm going to close by sharing what we asked of our children, which is, if you were in charge of research, what would you do to make sure studies were diverse? And they have a lot of ideas. We just have to listen. A lot of the ones that the children we spoke to focused on communication and partnering and relationship building. But I will tell you, they astutely recognized that it's going to take an extraordinary effort. These are some fun facts about the kids that I spoke to, and if you want to hear more from them in their own words, we've got excerpts from my interviews with them on the Pediatric Trials Network. But instead of my word, I want to close by giving the final word to one of our kids at ICANN, Rhiannon, who, when asked, what would you tell researchers who think that ensuring diversity is too hard, responded with this.
If you're a researcher and you are looking to make a difference in your community, then you're going to find a way, and you need to find a way. That's the fact of the matter. There is no more to it. You just have to do it. You know, if that's not what you're interested in, if you're not actually interested in making a change for patients, then this may not be the field for you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue, for that great talk and for keeping us on track. We're going to go ahead and take a 10-minute break, so if you can come back to this room at 10:30. So a 10-minute break and come back at 10:30. Thank you. Pam.
Thank you very much, Lily. Good morning, everybody. As Lily said, I'm Pam Simpkins, and I'm a managing partner at Mesopoint. It's an R&D strategy consulting firm. I've spent about 26 years in the biopharmaceutical industry. I just recently retired, but I have to say that the last 10 years were the most fulfilling because it was 100% dedicated to pediatric product development. So today I'm going to present an overview, a landscape overview of pediatric product development from industry's point of view. Ooh. Okay, so it's skipping some slides. Well, I'll speak to my disclaimer, which should be up there, but I have everything that I'm about to discuss today, the data and viewpoints are my own. I also have acknowledgments. First and foremost, I want to thank all of the millions of patients, pediatric patients and their caretakers who participate in pediatric clinical trials. The other acknowledgement, many, many thanks. I'm going to present a lot of data today. I have 2 data partners. Oh, thank you. My data partners, as most people know in pediatric product development, a lot of data sets are not structured with pediatrics in mind. There are many nuances. And so these partners have really helped me with evaluation very appropriately for pediatrics for 6 and 15 years respectively. So I want to give some thanks to both Maria and Sean. Okay, the slides are jumping around. May I have some assistance with the slides? It should be agenda. Okay, thank you very much. So today I'm going to cover 4 important topics. A historical view of industry-sponsored pediatric clinical trials, 2 short case studies that will bring the data to life, highlights of pediatric-specific nuances, and a forward-looking view to set the stage for action planning. Impetus. Okay, thank you. So why did I do this analysis and why is it on the agenda? Well, there are many efforts underway to improve pediatric product development, and I think all of those strategies would benefit from contextual information such as who's conducting pediatric research, what diseases and indications are being studied, where are we going in the world to enroll patients, how long is it taking to bring innovation to children, what are the complexities, and where should we focus our efforts? So I set out to answer those questions because there are no pediatric-specific comprehensive analyses of historical experience and upcoming trials. I won't have a lot of time today, so I'm just going to focus on information that we can then use with a goal towards setting the context for knowledge expansion and strategy development, setting the stage for later sessions in today's meeting. May I have the historical characterization. Oh, back. No, back from there. All right, let's see. Okay, here we are. So let's start with the historical view. So I reviewed 15 years of data, and I was focused only on industry-sponsored pediatric clinical trials. I included all phases, all indications, all countries, modalities, and sponsors. And my resulting data set has 2,500 clinical trials, all aiming to support the safe and effective use of therapies for children. So what did I find? Who's conducting these studies? Approximately half are conducted by relatively large companies, and the other half by mid-sized companies and biotechs. What percentage are required under the law? And some of this was alluded to earlier today. 2/3 are required by the law, specifically the Pharmaceutical Research Equity Act, or PREA, and 1/3 are voluntary. And the voluntary ones are typically pediatric-specific or pediatric-only studies, or they are conducted under the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act, or BPCA. And Dr. Heichman later today is going to talk more about the laws. In terms of therapeutic area distribution, it wasn't surprising to me, revealing dominance by immunology, inflammation, followed by neuroscience and vaccines. And the size and scope of our trials, excluding vaccines, shows small enrollment, which we expect, and significant dispersion across the world. And I won't have time today, but there's so many other important characterizations to examine, and they will be worthwhile to review, certainly in other meetings. Where are we going in the world? Over the 15-year period, the U.S. and the EU have been the primary locations for our pediatric trials, and I expect that to be the case going forward. So I was very curious about what has been happening more recently. So in the last 5 years, I noted some noteworthy changes. The war in Russia and Ukraine has halted research for children in those countries and in neighboring Turkey. China, South Korea, Argentina, and Canada have experienced significant increases in site openings, and South Africa and India have been declining significantly. Further investigation will be needed to understand why. So let's put country enrollment in perspective. And Susan alluded a bit to this in terms of small enrollment per site. So let's dig in a little bit here. So to provide a tangible example of what the last two slides really mean, so small studies with participants dispersed across the world, I'm going to share oncology. Very low disease prevalence. Total enrollment in late phases averages about 70 patients. And as you can see, we would need to go to 7 countries to enroll, resulting in approximately 10 patients per country. So this is a really good example of high dispersion. In comparison, adult oncology trials are 15 times larger per country. So I highlight this. This is one of only many differences to consider as we craft solutions for children. Our strategies are fundamentally different than those in adult research. So let's talk about time. How do all of these factors and many more that I could not cover today, including study design, contribute to the length of time it takes to complete a pediatric program? An analysis done a few years ago shows that there is a 9-year gap, 9 years, between adult approval and pediatric data in a label. This means This means that a new drug approved today for psoriasis in adults, as an example, might not have pediatric data until 2033. During 8 years of that time, pediatric programs are being conducted, and I think most people will agree this timeline is too long. And over the 15-year period, when I looked over all my data, unfortunately, that average has not improved. So as I said, 8 years is the average across all indications, but if you drill down to timeline estimates at the indication level, you'll see that each indication varies. So the starting point for ulcerative colitis, as an example, might be 9 years. But landscape dynamics will impact this time. What do I mean when I say dynamics? Let's look at UC a little bit more closely, but first some context. UC does occur in children, mostly in adolescents. It's more aggressive in children than in adults, so we do have a sense of urgency. There are approximately 2,000 children in the U.S. with moderate to severe UC. There are no differences in phenotypic presentation that have been noted by race. However, differences in clinical outcomes have been noted by race. Therefore, much more work has to be done. This will require much better understanding of the science and of social determinants of health. Given this context, let's say a sponsor plans to complete a program in 9 years, but that plan must be executed at the same time that several other products are trying to enroll the same participants. In moderate to severe UC, there simply aren't enough children to enroll them in all of these trials. So let's take this example. On the left-hand side, you see that there are 16 trials currently enrolling or planning to enroll in moderate to severe UC during the 2024 to 2030 period. These are actual studies. On the right-hand side, some data points. As I mentioned, there are only 2,000 children in the U.S. with moderate to severe UC. 415 of those children, or 20%, are currently being prescribed at least one newer drug off-label, so those children will not participate in a trial. 16 concurrent trials are active or will be, as I mentioned, and so given this situation, it will take 20 years to complete all of these studies, not 9. So I present this example because in pediatrics, adding in market dynamics and other factors specific to the indication and to the children who suffer from this disease is absolutely critical. When you do that, the 9-year timeline is clearly unrealistic. Let's switch to an indication with higher prevalence and see how historical data can be used to inform a strategy. So asthma is a good example. We know a lot more about the presentation in children by race and by gender. We also know where the asthma capitals are. These are cities with the highest prevalence, highest ER visits, and highest deaths from asthma. So I mapped those 20 asthma capitals shown here, and I also mapped historical patterns of site activations. In doing so, I identified a sponsor that was very consistent in site activations in those asthma capitals, so I contacted them. I interviewed a leader at that company and received their permission to present this blinded case study. I learned that this sponsor did not face the magnitude of concurrent trials like my UC example, but they faced other obstacles. And some of those we've covered early this morning. Distrust of research among parents, grandparents, faith-based leaders, and children was a significant issue. In addition, social determinants of health factors like environmental air quality, living with grandparents, reliance on adults for transportation, use of electronic diaries, all became major considerations in the enrollment and the retention strategy. And so my takeaways from this great interview were these. Go to where the patients are, reduce their burden, know the location, and understand the needs of diverse participants by going into the communities and asking. Put a patient-centered strategy to work. Community programming around working with school nurses was quite pivotal for this leader. Add adolescents to adult trials to drive faster access, and use data science, specifically extrapolation, which is the borrowing of data from other cohorts, either adults or older children, whenever that's appropriate. All of these things in this leader's mind were absolutely critical to shortening the timelines. With this in place, the leader's goal was to cut the median timeline almost in half and collect generalizable data because her participants would reflect the population intended for this therapy. And while she's not quite done with the trial yet, she fully expects that this strategy will help her team collect all the data that they need and exceed their diversity goal. It was a great story, and it was wonderful interviewing her. So at a much higher level, this historical landscape work enables us to narrow our focus on important actions that can have a positive impact on the quality, speed, and efficiency of pediatric product development. It also deepens our understanding of the challenges, all of which I'm confident we can overcome, so that we can be proactive and thoughtful in addressing them, and I only list a few here. So let's wrap up the historical view. Pediatric product development continues to be long and complex, and I hope the data and examples I provided gives you perspective on what I really mean when I say that. Given our collective goal to improve the process and outcomes for children, I hope this historical perspective provides good context for forward-looking strategies, including those needed to achieve the appropriate representation in our trials. So with history behind us, let's look forward. How do we know what's coming down the pipeline for pediatrics? Well, what we do typically is we look at the adult pipeline. Why? You remember earlier I mentioned that 67% of pediatric clinical trials are required under PREA, and therefore they typically follow the adult approvals. So the adult pipeline is also often used to provide directional feel for upcoming industry-sponsored pediatric clinical trial activity. So I looked at the adult pipeline. This slide shows the volume of late-stage adult clinical trials currently happening in these 6 indications. I pulled these 6 because they are very relevant for pediatric research. If the products in these indications are approved, it is very likely that a pediatric clinical trial will be required by law. Based on this volume, it's likely that we will have some challenges with multiple concurrent studies in type 2 diabetes, obesity, and atopic derm, very similar to my UC case study, since many companies are pursuing new products in these indications. So my question is, given what we know about these indications and about historical patterns discussed today, what insights can we apply to future pediatric trials? How can we be proactive? Wrapping up, we know what's coming. Significant upcoming pediatric activity will be important in 10+ indications. And we have the opportunity now to plan to do better. Better in trial designs, better in enrollment, better in achieving diversity, better in creating faster access for our children. What I do know is that we can do it together, and I love when Michelle said, endurance for hope. I have very strong hope that we can do it together. I'd like us to use this information and our collective knowledge to formulate actionable strategies that benefit all children so they have speedy access to the therapies they deserve. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pam. We're going to transition to the panel discussion now, and I would like to invite Dr. Deanna Green, who's the Director of the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics, as well as Lois Lee, who's a Senior Associate in Pediatrics in the Division of Emergency Medicine at Boston Children's Hospital, to co-moderate the panel discussion, along with the panelists. If you can go ahead and come up now, please.
Well, thank you to all the panelists today who have already spoken, and then we have 3 panelists who are joining, and we have questions from our virtual audience, but also we would love to take questions from all of you. But we are going to start with our 3 panelists who have not presented yet, and first is Sneha Dave. If you want to just tell us a little bit about why you're here today.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Sneha. I am the Executive Director at Generation Patient, which is an organization I created when I was 13 years old. I've been living with severe ulcerative colitis since I was a little under 6 years old. And I had the colectomy surgery, which is the removal of my large intestine, when I was in high school, which prompted me to create one of the only organizations focused on young adults, so thinking about this transition period between pediatric and adulthood. And now we have 4 staff members. We're entirely young adult patient-led, and we focus on areas of peer support, health policy, which includes clinical trials and leadership programming.
Thank you, Sneha, for joining us today. So we're just going to start with a few questions for you. Given Dr. Abdel Rahman's presentation included, I love the videos with the input from our patients regarding their thoughts about clinical trial diversity. What stood out to you about some of the perspectives they shared?
Yeah, I think the last video with Rhiannon was particularly empowering for me personally, and I think really alludes to the point that there's an urgency that we as patients feel that may not always be felt by those who don't have the same lived experience of being a patient. I also think in general from the presentation and from the perspectives, it was really fascinating because I think we think about engagement and about community as part of the trials, and I think maybe 80% of the conversations that were being had or problems can be solved by engaging the community members. But I even think it goes beyond engagement and thinking about how can we have patients leading as PIs on some of these projects and some of these clinical trials. I think, you know, we, especially as young adult patients, see our role as not only engaging, but also being able to drive some of this research. So, for example, on a PCORI award, which is not a clinical trial, we are the youngest PIs on a PCORI award. And so really thinking, you know, differently about how we can be engaging and enabling patients to be driving some of these outcomes, endpoint developments from the very beginning, I think was really, part of my perspective. I have other things, but I'll pause because I don't want to take up the whole panel.
Do we have any questions for the audience? Otherwise, I'll have one more question for Sneha. Okay, one more question for you. As a patient representative, what are some of your key concerns about trial participation that differ across diverse pediatric populations?
Yeah, I think for myself, so my parents are both immigrants, and so from India, and so thinking about the different cultural backgrounds of how Western medicine has been viewed, and really being able to open up conversations about what are your beliefs as part of this trial in addition to these standardized therapies that we're thinking about. I also think in terms of being able to communicate things in a plain language, like we're testing this for this reason is a way that you could just make things very clear and simple in terms of communicating what a trial is in the first place, because even the word clinical trial feels very scary to a lot of people, especially for kids and younger folks. So, and then just two other things really quickly on that. I just really feel like there's a huge opportunity with long-term safety data and a lot of questions that we still think about as patients, but also I can only imagine for care partners and parents what that's like. And I think there's a huge opportunity to do a better job with being able to show that this is how we're going to be thinking about long-term safety data after the trial. And I mean, I know in IVD, there's so much that needs to be done. So anyway, last thing I'll just say is the affordability of the therapeutics, especially as we're aging into adulthood, older adolescents. I mean, we are thinking about the financial repercussions of being able to afford therapeutics after the trial as well. So post-trial access is something that needs to be clarified because, I mean, personally, I'm on a medication that costs a lot of money and I have to make decisions about my life based off of that. And so when we're thinking about trust, I think, part of that is, are we making sure that these therapeutics are available and accessible and affordable after the trial too?
Thank you very much, Sneha. So next, I'd like to turn to you, Dr. Bourgeois, to introduce yourself, and then we have a couple of questions for you.
Wonderful. Hello, everyone. So nice to be here today. My name is Florence Bourgeois. I'm a clinician scientist at Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. My research focus is around building informatics-based tools to support pediatric infrastructures or research infrastructures and clinical trial networks, and evaluating methods and new approaches around policies and statistical tools to conduct research towards the development and approval of pediatric therapeutics.
Great, thank you very much. So we just heard from Pam Simpkins, and she really did walk us through a very in-depth pediatric landscape analysis that was rich in data and had quite a few insights that I think will be food for thought for all of us to chew on throughout the rest of the day. But I'd like to start with you to first hear what are some of your thoughts on the information she shared.
Yes, thank you for that. So I think Pam's presentation was really terrific and pivoted a little bit from the issue of diversity in clinical trials to the more fundamental question of just equity for kids, period, compared to adult drug development. So a lot of the data that she showed, again, underscored the need to highlight pediatric research and drug and device development for children because the focus continues to be for adults. I like to say that most drugs and devices are not developed for children, but they are sometimes eventually studied in children. And so this driver of the adult priorities then being sort of what we end up with for kids is something that we should really think about. And what are some of the approaches to pivot towards a focus that is driven from the pediatric needs standpoint?
And so based on your experience, given your research and looking at participation and diversity, where are some areas that you feel that things are going well in terms of diversity in clinical trials?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with drugs and devices in particular, many of these trials are for diseases that are primarily treated in tertiary care organizations, the hospitals, which tend to be in more urban locations. And so for drugs and device trials, we tend to see greater diversity, which is actually nicely shown in the study that I think Christine maybe showed, Sue, with the BPCA studies and their representation. So among drug trials, there was good representation and diversity for those studies. Again, these are very specialized interventions in patient populations, so we're doing well on that front, but as you pointed out, this may not generalize to all trials across other types of diseases or intervention types.
Thank you. And do we have any questions from the audience before we move on to our next panelist? Well, I invite you to think of your questions, and please just line up at the mics, and we will call on you once you do. Thank you.
Next on our panel is Dr. Ann McMahon. So if you could tell us a little bit about why you're here today, and we'll have some questions for you as well.
Thank you. My name is Ann McMahon, and I work at the FDA. I've been here for 22 years, and I think that you heard Dr. Lee talk about briefly about the study that they are funding for us to do in the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics that we've been doing over the last year. And so I wanted to just say a few words about that. I just also wanted to give credit to the team which has been working on this, from the Division of Pediatric and Maternal Health, and from the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics, and from the Office of Biostatistics. We looked at trials submitted to the FDA under BPCA and PREA, and focused on children with diabetes type 1, diabetes type 2, and obesity. We chose those diseases because there are high proportions of Hispanics and non-whites among children with these diseases in the U.S. Therefore, potential underrepresentation of these groups could have an important effect on the population at large. We used 3 U.S. Databases giving us races and ethnicities in the general population of children with these diseases in the U.S. The SEARCH study for diabetes in youth, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, or NHANES that you may have heard of, and the U.S. Census data. We performed chi-squares to compare clinical trial race and ethnicity prevalence in the general population with the clinical trial race and ethnicity prevalence with the background data, that is the disease-specific background data and the prevalence of race and ethnicity in that. So what we found, the preliminary data is that compared to the race ethnicity distribution in the U.S. pediatric population with diabetes type 1, type 2, and obesity, there was strong evidence of underrepresentation at the p less than 0.05 level by race and ethnicity for diabetes type 1, diabetes type 2, and obesity. I'm not going to go into the specific numbers. We're putting together our data at the moment, but it's definite that there was underrepresentation in a number of the trials submitted to the FDA.
So it's great to hear about the internal work that's being done at the FDA, as well as we heard about some of the external work being done in academia and industry. So obviously having everybody's sort of eyes on this, moving forward will help us improve our enrollment and participation. We had sort of talked about some metrics for appropriateness for the prevalence of race and ethnicity in pediatric clinical trials. So are there any existing, metrics that we can kind of look to as we build metrics for the future?
Well, our study gives you an example of a quote metric, which is p less than 0.05, comparing to some background group as compared to the clinical trial. but I would not say that that's, by any stretch of the imagination, a metric that has been accepted in the general research community. And I would say that my search of the literature suggests that various statistical methods are generally used to determine underrepresentation. But I didn't find a lot of concurrence about specific statistical methods that should, quote unquote, be used.
Thank you. And I think part of the problem has also been pointed out. We don't know the true prevalence of the diseases in some of our populations, so it's hard to know what the baseline is, much less where we should be as far as our enrollment. So thank you.
Thank you.
So Anne, there was one clarifying question for you online, which was what data sets were used for the pediatric study that you're describing. Can you clarify that those studies were submitted to the agency and maybe talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. The studies that we used were submitted under BPCA or PREA, and I can't tell you which studies were from which right now, but they were submitted to the agency under BPCA and PREA. Carla, do you want to say more? Okay, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And we have a question from the audience. Please go ahead. And if you can say your name, affiliation, and your question.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Carla Epps. I'm from FDA, from the Division of Pediatrics and Maternal Health. My question is about, for me anyways, an elephant in the room that some people don't apparently see, which is the fierce urgency of now in addressing diversity in the pediatric population. I was actually one of the members of the team that Anne alluded to, and for some other of my work. What I wanted to point out is that for the pediatric population in the U.S., it is already a minority-majority population, and yet I don't hear how that's being taken into consideration for activities around this issue. So I don't know if people wanted to speak to that. Thank you.
Would anyone like to start? Do you need clarification? I think there needs to be a little clarification on the question.
I guess one is just, do you hear in activities that you all are involved in about the fact that we have, our children are a very diverse population, more so than the adults, and what does that mean already, and rapidly increasing, and what does that mean in terms of the pace or the focus of activities on increasing diversity in pediatric trials? Thank you.
I don't know if this answers the question exactly, but what I can comment on is the need to capture that diversity more accurately. So right now, when we're making comparisons between diversity in clinical trials and the U.S. population, we're largely using U.S. Census data, which if you look at it is quite crude and really not reflective of the current demographic diversity in our children. For example, there's an increasing proportion of children who self-identify as multi-race or ethnicity, and that is not accurately captured. Neither are many of the other emerging subgroups. So I would say in order to adequately address this moving forward, we also need standardized race and ethnicity classifications that reflect our pediatric population.
I just wanted to add to that. That's a great point. So currently right now with our OMB SPD 15, there is an update to our standardization of race and ethnicity capture. So right now patients can check more than one box. So for example, my son can check Asian and white, as my husband is white. So this will increase our availability of data standards, but availability of data. But going back to Carla's question, as she's asking the question, I keep thinking back to the last roundtable that we had, which was in the rural communities. And as we know, there is a very, very high increasing proportion of diverse children in rural communities, and there's, very unique nuances and barriers that we need to increase our awareness to. So thank you so much, Carla, for that question.
Thank you. So we're going to take one question from online, and actually it has to do with Michael being willing to share earlier. And again, thank you, Michael, your struggle with having to wait 4 years to be in a clinical trial. And so the question is, the individual states that this reminded them about the gap that exists that Pam pointed out between when a product gets approved for use in adults to when there's information for use in children in the labeling. And their question for the full panel is, do you think that diversity action plans will help shorten that gap, or do you think it will become yet another barrier to the prevention of efficient and effective pediatric clinical trials?
I'd love to start. So as my data showed, we really have to look indication by indication. So I don't want us to make sort of broad, sweeping commentary about all of pediatric product development, because I think that would be a disservice. The last thing I think we want is to add to the number of years that gap can grow if we make sort of blanket statements or goals about what we ought to achieve. I'll just draw on the example from the asthma interview. What I found was really striking with this particular leader. The reason she was so confident that she could cut the time was because she was very focused on excellence by design. So if at the very beginning of your design, as you're crafting your strategy, you know that diversity has to be very critical to your success. We all want generalizable data. You can't have generalizable data if your data doesn't reflect the population intended for treatment. So that's a tenet that we've always lived by. So start with that as your design at the very, very beginning. And I'm confident then that actually you will shorten the timeline because you're looking at the right population that ought to be enrolled.
Thank you. That's a great point. Anyone else? I think that summarizes it because, yes, being intentional from the outset, being strategic, and also leveraging best practices, which we hope will come out of a workshop like today, that will help inform other investigators and sponsors about what has worked and what clearly doesn't work, is going to help us move forward. So next we'll go to a question from our audience.
Hello, Michelle McMurray-Heath from Biotequity Clinical. We're CRO helping companies diversify trials. And I just wanted to expand upon the earlier audience question, which is something I hear a lot from pharmaceutical companies. What does good look like? We know what bad looks like, but what is the goal? Is the goal representation of the general population? Is the goal representation of the diagnosis? Is the goal just enough representation to get statistically significant conclusions? I think we need a conversation about where we're trying to go, so everyone can, adjust accordingly.
Very fair points. Thank you very much. Yes, please, Anne.
That's a great question, and, we debated it some, but pretty rapidly came to the conclusion that we thought it was fair to compare clinical trial, the disease or condition that was being studied in the clinical trial, to compare that to that disease or condition in the general population. And in this case, it's the general population in the United States, because the FDA was the one that was receiving the information. So that's where we came from. I think it's fair, but I know it's not the only possible answer.
One additional thought on that is, beyond thinking about sort of the necessity of having generalizable results through good representation, I think another factor to consider is also good needs to mean that we have equity in terms of access to new, innovative, emerging therapies across diverse populations. So it's not just about generalizability, but it's also about equity to access to these therapeutics.
One more question from our audience, and then we'll take a question from the virtual audience.
Thank you for that question, and I wanted to follow up by what is good. And so I think I'm trying to struggle with this, because what is good for one community might not be good for another community, because there are historical difficulties with the medical model with certain communities, and certain communities have struggled and been victims of poor research and poor medical research science. So what would good be like in communities? Would that be maybe the community saying, because I think we're looking for a gold standard of good, and I don't know if that's the answer. I think communities with the researcher, with outcomes, with clinical trials, define what is good for them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kipp. You're always here with so much wisdom. That is entirely correct. In fact, what we have seen is that beyond just the communities themselves, it also depends on the disease state. For example, our work with the Hepatitis B Foundation, what we have found is that religious leaders are a no-go when it comes to clinical trial diversity. So many times with stigmatized conditions, having religious leaders convey the clinical trial message actually prevents the community from engaging in clinical trials. So beyond just race and ethnicity, I think it's very important to look at the disease also. Also working with the tribal nations, gene therapy has many layers of, I think nuances before we even get to the conversations when it comes to gene therapy. Another issue that I wanted to highlight from Dr. Kipp's point is that if we are not careful with engagement, many times what we have found is that the community will close its doors to us. So, that is something, and it is almost impossible to re-engage then, and you might have to wait generations for that next opportunity. So just for something to think about beyond race, ethnicity, age, geographical location, disease states, the nuances are incredibly important to understand.
Thank you. So we're going to take one question from our virtual audience and then one more question in the audience here. So this is for Dr. Christine Lee. Many clinical trials are global, as we've seen today, and in these countries, race and ethnicity information is not even disclosed due to privacy concerns, although only aggregated data are usually what's reported out. is the FDA collaborating with other health authorities in other countries on this issue?
That's a great question. Did this person read my mind? Yes, that is a topic that we are currently exploring in great depth, and we hope to, have something out in the next year or so. So, yes, I guess they did a spoiler. Oh, yes.
Okay, another question from our in-person audience.
Thank you for allowing me to ask the question, and great discussion so far. And I think, have 2 points intertwined, which is a little bit started, Pam, by your great presentation on the history of things. I'm not 100% sure that the future will really look the same, and we embark so much on PRIA and adult indications. If we look in the upcoming, what is coming in the science on cell and gene, on the high medical need, and ultra-rare and rare diseases, which for me pose 2 questions. I think we may see a much higher need for education for patients and doctors with regard to this, because treatment pathways will even become much more complicated. And on the other hand, studies may become much smaller on the one end, but on the other hand, we may really need much more global reach for this. So I think for me is the question, how can we go in with a diversity paradigm which focuses then only on the prevalence in one country? Because I think we really have then to look global, and if we look at rare diseases, ultra-rare diseases, cell and gene, so that might be the next iteration, because this is a great start point, but I really wonder what would be the outlook for this. And it's for the whole panel. I don't know who starts.
Well, I'll start. So, as you can fully appreciate in my data set, there was so much that I could not cover today, but I did see real momentum in cell and gene therapy, and the fact that children, because many, these are congenital diseases, you're seeing children enrolled in first-in-human studies, right? So I think that's going to change what we've seen historically with that pattern of children following adults. There's a merge now here between what I think we've been learning in the rare disease community and pediatrics. I mean, you could argue that all pediatric or most pediatric diseases are rare diseases, but I think historically we haven't really talked about them together. But here we're seeing sort of a natural merge where we can share strategies, learn from each other, but I do think it's going to be a very different paradigm, because we're going to see studies where the first label will include children, at least a cohort of children.
Anyone else? Okay, well then I would like to turn to you, Sue, and I want to thank you for your presentation. I think your incorporation of the patient perspective was very powerful, and I had the chance to look at some of the other parts of your interview by going to the link you mentioned, and I hope the rest of the audience will as well, because there's some really important pearls of wisdom that these children are providing to all of us. But my question for you is, based on all you know and all of your experience, where can investments be made that's going to really help to enhance representation within clinical trials?
I think there are a lot of areas, and many of which I touched on in the talk, and I want to kind of leap off from the point you made about these intentional designs when it comes to trials. And we can have the best intention when it comes to intentional trial design, but if your academic partners can't deliver on providing the patients, that's a real problem. And I firmly believe that there should be some benchmarking mechanism that is available. We have to be able to, if I've got a rare disease and I've got the luxury of resources, I'm going to look for the hospital that's got the best record for outcomes for that disease. And I think industry should be able to look at data preemptively to make intelligent decisions about clinical trial site selection. So I certainly think that's one area. Another area where investments are probably sorely needed, and I think we heard kind of that reinforced through a lot of the presentations today, is in educational toolkits, education around communication, and toolkits around communication. We cannot approach partners and their parents, communities, children in the same way, for research in the same way we approach them for clinical trials, for practice. My communication with a patient is very different when I'm caring for them. It's a lot more paternalistic and informative as opposed to when I'm trying to engage them in clinical research, which, again, we've heard that term bidirectional a lot. It's very bidirectional. It involves a lot more listening than it does communication, and I don't know that we are taught that as investigators. I think it's something that we either is innately a part of what we do as clinical academics and practitioners, or it's not. And I think there needs to be some guidance there.
Well, we're very fortunate to have a representative on our panel from Generation Patient, and we would love to hear your thoughts about communication. What are areas where you see that there's maybe training or input that we can all take away to say how best can we communicate to patients and families about the importance of clinical trials, but also ensuring we're listening clearly to their needs?
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing that's always been really tricky for me to understand is the wide developmental stages of pediatrics. So thinking about the fact that like a 8-year-old is very different than a 16-year-old, and the materials needed to be delivered to a 16-year-old might not look like cartoons or things that are like, more for children, for younger children. So I think it's really important to, one, note that, but two, it's really can be confusing sometimes when care partners who have the best intentions are also in the mix. I think sometimes, parents tend to, with all due respect to my parents, tend to, think that they know what's best for their kids, and they certainly are trying their very best, but at the same time, we need to ask kids, even if they're 8 years old, 9 years old, and we need to give them that agency and that power that they can, make informed decisions or be part of that process. And I think this generation of kids that are coming up are going to have the tools to be able to do that more so than any other generation of kids. And so I think we can utilize social media, graphics, and things like that. And I really do think there's an opportunity for the FDA to even work with more community groups to develop more plain language materials for their communities. And even education that the FDA is putting out, I think, can be designed by community groups for the broader public as well. So, yeah.
Thank you for that perspective. So in our last few minutes, trying to end a little bit on a high note, what is already being done that is successful that we can continue and should build upon? And this is open to all our panelists.
Okay, I'll jump in. So something I'm really excited about, specifically in pediatrics, is the use of data science. There's so much that we already know, and we should be leveraging that data to supplement what we could learn in clinical trials, almost to the point where, in many instances, our trials don't have to be as long and as big as they are because we're borrowing data that already exists that can really inform the safe and effective use of our therapies. I'm thinking specifically of extrapolation. I'd love to see a stronger uptake there, and really public-private conversations around the use of extrapolation, because I think there's a lot that we can learn from each other. Other types of data science techniques, like the use of Bayesian statistics. There are a number of different things that we can do with technology and data to really streamline pediatric product development. If you can't tell already, I continue to be disturbed by the length of time. I do think that we have a lot at our disposal to help bring medicines to children faster.
I would say an area that I'm very excited about is the emergence of remote clinical trial participation, accessing populations who, Michelle mentioned you're 7 miles from Lurie, but 7 miles in Chicago takes 40 minutes to get there. So making sure that we are starting to look at trial designs that allow us to go where the patient is instead of having them come to us.
I'll expand just a little bit on the sort of potential of data science that Pam brought up. So in addition to extrapolation, there are vast amounts of digital data now available that can be accessed to augment and complement randomized controlled trials, which, as we know, are incredibly resource intensive and difficult in small dispersed populations, such as many pediatric illnesses. So with all these electronic health record data, for example, insurance claims data, we can conduct observational studies, again, to complement our traditional RCTs. The big issue there that remains to be addressed is that beyond just demographic factors, what we really need are many of the variables that get at social determinants of health. And that is currently incredibly challenging. And so thinking of ways that we can better use these observational data sets to capture these relevant variables to get at differential access to healthcare and responses to different types of interventions will be a critical step to make full use of this potential additional resource.
We're providing, at the moment, working on a article talking about pharmacoepidemiology in pediatrics, and one of the things that we're talking about is putting AI in there, and I would say AI is something that is probably going to make a difference in the coming 10 to 20 years for, exactly as you were saying, for pharmacoepidemiology in pediatrics and in general. And also, I just wanted to say that this kind of a conference that is being put on today is a great boon for the field. I mean, I think it really gives us a sense of where we need to be going.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I think you'll have the last word there, Anne, because we're at time. And I think that's a really nice way to summarize it. This conference is signaling where we're going, but it's also signaling what we're prioritizing. So I want to thank our panelists and speakers for their input this morning and expertise. Please join me in thanking them.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our moderators and panelists. This marks the end of session 1, which was current status of pediatric trial participation and lessons learned. So the rest of the day will focus on inclusion strategies. So we're going to go ahead and take a 1-hour lunch break. So if we can reconvene at 12:30. It's slightly less than an hour, but 12:30, if you can please come back so we can get started with the rest of the day. Thanks so much.